Right now, close your mouth. Pick any note at all, and sustain it for 10 seconds. Feel where the vibration goes. Not just in your throat, not just in your skull, but down. Into your chest cavity, into the bones of your rib cage, into the long hollow tubes of your femurs. You just activated a biological mechanism that your ancestors used for reasons you have never been taught. You just did something that changes the chemistry of the air inside your head. And you did it without knowing any of it. There is a measurement taken in under 10 seconds requiring no equipment beyond a flat stretch of ground that predicts how long you will live more accurately than your blood pressure, your cholesterol, or your smoking history. The test is called the one-legged standing test. You stand on one foot, barefoot, eyes open, arms at your sides. And you count how many seconds you can hold it before you have to put the other foot down or hop. That's it. And the data is startling. In 2014, a team led by Yuri Ogaya at the University of Sao Paulo published a study in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology where they tracked 1,702 adults aged 51 to 75 for an average of 6.7 years. They found that people who could not stand on one leg for 10 seconds had an 84% higher risk of death from any cause over the follow-up period. Not from falling, from any cause. Stroke, heart attack, cancer, respiratory failure. The inability to balance on one foot for 10 seconds predicted mortality more strongly than any single cardiovascular risk factor they measured. And nobody knows exactly why. Let me be clear about what is known and what is not. The correlation is robust. It has been replicated in multiple populations, including a 2022 study from the same Brazilian group published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that confirmed the finding in nearly 4,000 participants. The mechanism, however, is not fully mapped. The leading hypothesis is that one-legged standing time is a proxy for the integrity of multiple physiological systems that decline together. Balance requires input from the vestibular system in your inner ear, the proprioceptive sensors in your muscles and joints, the visual system, and the motor cortex of your brain, and all of these depend on adequate blood flow, nerve conduction velocity, and muscle strength. A failure in any one of these pathways shows up first in the balance test. Because balance is the most demanding sensor-motor integration task your body performs without your conscious attention. But here is the part that makes this story genuinely unsettling. The test does not predict falling. It predicts dying. And the gap between those two things is where the real mystery lives. Now I want you to think about what it actually means to balance on one foot. You are not holding still. You cannot hold still. Your body is making continuous micro-adjustments, tiny shifts in ankle angle, hip rotation, spinal curvature at a rate of roughly 10 to 15 corrections per second. Each correction is a decision. Your cerebellum receives input from 3 separate sources: your eyes, your inner ear, and the stretch receptors in your muscles and tendons. It integrates that information, compares it to your intention to remain upright, and sends motor commands down through the spinal cord to the muscles of your ankle, your knee, your hip, and your trunk. All of this happens below the level of conscious thought. You are unaware of the computation. You only feel the result. You are still standing. The most remarkable part of this machinery is the vestibular system. Deep inside your temporal bone, embedded in the hardest bone in the human body, there are 3 fluid-filled semicircular canals oriented at roughly right angles to each other. They detect angular acceleration rotation of the head in any direction. Between the canals, there are two otolith organs, the utricle and the saccule, which detect linear acceleration and gravity. When you tilt your head, tiny calcium carbonate crystals called otoconia shift under gravity, bending hair cells that fire signals to your brainstem. The system is exquisitely sensitive. The hair cells can detect displacements of less than a nanometer, about 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. And the entire system is ancient. The basic architecture of the vestibular system is shared across all vertebrates. Sharks have it. Frogs have it. The semicircular canals first appeared in fish over 400 million years ago, and they have changed remarkably little since. But here's the problem. The vestibular system is not designed for the way you live today. It evolved for a world where your head moved constantly, walking on uneven ground, running from predators, tracking moving objects across a landscape. In the modern world, your head is stationary for hours at a time while you stare at a screen. And then you stand up and expect the system to work perfectly. The mismatch is profound. When you hold your head still for long periods, the fluid in your semicircular canal settles. The hair cells adapt. The baseline firing rate of the vestibular nerve drifts. And when you suddenly stand up and try to balance on one foot, the system has to recalibrate on the fly. The time it takes to recalibrate, measured in milliseconds, may be one of the things the one-legged standing test is actually measuring. There is another layer to this that most people never consider. Balance is not just a mechanical problem. It is a metabolic problem. Maintaining upright posture requires continuous muscle activation, and muscle activation consumes energy. The muscles of your lower leg, particularly the soleus and the tibialis anterior, are constantly firing to keep your center of mass over your base of support. On a typical day, these muscles may contract tens of thousands of times just to keep you upright. Each contraction requires calcium ion release, ADP hydrolysis, and the clearing of metabolic waste products. Over time, the efficiency of this system declines. Blood flow to the muscles decreases. The mitochondria become less efficient. The neuromuscular junction degrades. And the first place this shows up is in a task that demands the most from the system, standing on one foot. Let me take you inside the mechanism of that decline, because it is not random and it is not uniform across the body. There is a specific sequence. The proprioceptive sensors in your joints and muscles, the muscle spindles, and the Golgi tendon organs begin to lose sensitivity as early as your 30s. The muscle spindles, which detect changes in muscle length, contain specialized intrafusal fibers that are innervated by gamma motor neurons. With age, the number of intrafusal fibers decreases, and the remaining fibers become less responsive to stretch. The signal-to-noise ratio of the proprioceptive signal drops. Your brain receives a fuzzier picture of where your limbs are in space. To compensate, your brain relies more heavily on visual input. You start looking at your feet when you walk. You start needing light to balance. This is why older adults fall more often in dim environments. It is not that their muscles are weak. Though they may be, it is that their brain has lost one of its three inputs and is trying to run the computation on two. The second system to degrade is the vestibular system itself. The hair cells in the semicircular canals and the otolith organs do not regenerate. You are born with roughly 30,000 hair cells in each vestibular apparatus, and you lose them gradually over your lifetime. By age 75, you may have lost 40% or more. The otoconia, those calcium carbonate crystals that shift under gravity, can also fragment or dislodge, a condition called benign paroxysmal positional vertigo that affects roughly 2.4% of the general population, but up to 11% of people over 80. When otoconia break loose, they float into the semicircular canals, where they create false signals of rotation. The brain receives information that your head is spinning when it is not. The mismatch between the vestibular signal and the visual signal produces vertigo and nausea. And the system becomes unreliable exactly when you need it most. Now here is where the one-legged standing test becomes something more than a simple balance check. The inability to stand on one foot for 10 seconds may be capturing the cumulative effect of all these degradations: proprioceptive loss, vestibular decline, muscle atrophy, and vascular insufficiency in a single measurement. It is a composite biomarker, and composite biomarkers are often more powerful predictors of outcomes than any single physiological measurement, because they integrate information across multiple systems. Your blood pressure is one number. Your cholesterol is one number. Your one-legged standing time is the output of a computation involving your brain, your inner ear, your muscles, your blood vessels, and your nerves. It is a whole system test. This is why the correlation with mortality is so strong and why it persists even after adjusting for age, sex, body mass index, and known chronic diseases. The one-legged standing test does not just measure your risk of falling. It measures the integrity of the systems that keep you alive. When those systems begin to fail, the failure shows up first in the most demanding task, the one that requires the fastest integration of the most information. And that task, for a bipedal animal standing on a single narrow base of support, is keeping your center of mass over your foot while the world rotates beneath you at 10,000ths of a degree per second. And this brings us to a question that the research has not fully answered, but that every person who has ever taken this test has asked themselves: can you improve your score? Can you train your one-legged standing time the way you train your bench press or your VO2 max? The answer is yes, but the mechanism of improvement is not what most people assume. It is not about strengthening your ankle muscles, though that helps. It is about retraining the integration. A 2015 study led by Michael Garland at the University of California, Irvine, published in the Journal of Clinical Neurology, took 30 older adults with a history of falls and put them through a 6-week balance training program. The program consisted of standing on one foot, standing on a foam surface, walking heel to toe, and turning in place, all exercises that challenge the vestibular and proprioceptive systems. After 6 weeks, the participants improved their one-legged standing time by an average of 42%. But here is the detail that matters. The improvement was not linear. The participants who started with the worst balance improved the most. And the improvement was not correlated with changes in muscle strength. It was correlated with changes in the brain. Functional MRI scans showed increased activation in the cerebellar vermis and the vestibular cortex after training. The brain had rewired itself to process balance information more efficiently. The muscles did not get stronger. The integration got faster. This principle extends beyond balance. There is a growing body of evidence that training the vestibular and proprioceptive systems has downstream effects on cognitive function. A 2018 meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine reviewed 27 studies involving over 4,000 participants and found that balance training improved working memory, spatial cognition, and executive function with effect sizes comparable to those of aerobic exercise. The mechanism is speculative but plausible. The vestibular system projects directly to the hippocampus, the brain structure responsible for spatial memory and navigation. When you stimulate the vestibular system through balance exercises, you may be indirectly stimulating the hippocampus as well. The connection is anatomical. The vestibular nuclei in the brainstem send projections to the thalamus, which relays information to the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, and the posterior parietal cortex. Every time you balance, you are exercising not just your body, but a network of brain regions involved in memory and spatial reasoning. There is a second mechanism worth considering, and it involves the cerebellum. The cerebellum contains more than half of the neurons in the entire brain, roughly 69 billion of the 86 billion total. Its primary function is motor coordination, but it also plays a role in cognitive timing, attention switching, and error correction. When you practice balancing on one foot, you are subjecting your cerebellum to a high-frequency demand for error correction, 10 to 15 corrections per second, each one requiring the cerebellum to compare the predicted state of your body against the actual sensory feedback and adjust the motor command accordingly. This is computationally expensive, and the more you do it, the more efficient the cerebellar circuits become. The Purkinje cells, the output neurons of the cerebellar cortex, undergo long-term depression at the parallel fiber synapses, a form of synaptic plasticity that fine-tunes the timing of motor commands. The result is faster, more accurate corrections with less conscious effort. You do not think about balancing anymore. You just balance. Now let me take you to a place where this story becomes genuinely strange. The one-legged standing test is not just a predictor of mortality. It is also a predictor of cognitive decline. A 2022 study led by Simi Lee at the University of Tsukuba in Japan, published in BMC Geriatrics, followed 1,319 older adults for 4 years and found that those who could not stand on one leg for 20 seconds were at significantly higher risk of developing dementia even after adjusting for age, education, and cardiovascular risk factors. The hazard ratio was 1.67, a 67% increase in risk. The question is why? One hypothesis is that the same vascular pathology that impairs blood flow to the brain also impairs blood flow to the vestibular system and the cerebellum. Small vessel disease, which is common in aging, reduces the perfusion of the deep white matter tracts that connect the cerebellum to the cortex. When those tracts are compromised, both balance and cognition suffer. But there is a second hypothesis that is more interesting and less well known. The vestibular system itself may play a direct role in maintaining the health of the hippocampus. A 2010 study by Paul Smith at the University of Otago in New Zealand showed that rats with bilateral vestibular lesions, surgically removing their vestibular input, developed significant atrophy of the hippocampus within 3 months. The hippocampal volume decreased by roughly 15%, and the rats developed spatial memory deficits that persisted even after compensation. The vestibular system, it turns out, provides a tonic input to the hippocampus that is necessary for the survival of hippocampal neurons. Remove the input, and the neurons die. If this finding translates to humans, and there is preliminary evidence that it does, from studies of patients with bilateral vestibular loss who show hippocampal atrophy and spatial memory impairment, then the implications are profound. The one-legged standing test may be capturing, indirectly, the health of a neural circuit that is essential for memory. The better you balance, the more vestibular input reaches your hippocampus. The more vestibular input reaches your hippocampus, the more robust your hippocampal neurons remain. Balance training becomes, in this framework, a form of cognitive maintenance. Not because it makes you think harder, but because it keeps alive the neurons that do the thinking. There is a third mechanism that I want to mention, even though the evidence is preliminary, because it points to something that the research community is only beginning to explore. The vestibular system is one of the earliest sensory systems to develop in utero. The semicircular canals are fully formed by the 8th week of gestation. The otolith organs are functional by the 14th week. The fetus begins moving in response to vestibular stimulation before it can hear, before it can see, before it can feel touch on its skin. The vestibular system is the foundation upon which all other sensory systems are built. And some researchers have proposed that the vestibular system may continue to play a scaffolding role throughout life, that it provides a spatial and gravitational reference frame that organizes perception, memory, and even emotion. When the scaffolding weakens, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. The one-legged standing test may be measuring the integrity of that scaffolding. I want to tell you about a woman named Dr. Faye Horak, a neuroscientist at Oregon Health and Science University who has spent her entire career studying balance and falls. In the 1990s, she developed a test called the Balance Evaluation Systems Test, or BESTEST, which takes 30 minutes to administer and assesses balance across 6 different physiological systems: biomechanical constraints, stability limits, anticipatory postural adjustments, postural responses, sensory orientation, and gait stability. It is the gold standard for clinical balance assessment. And what Horak and her colleagues have shown, across dozens of studies, is that balance is not a single ability. It is a collection of abilities, each mediated by a different neural circuit, each vulnerable to a different type of pathology. Some people fall because their vestibular system is degraded. Others fall because their proprioceptive feedback is delayed. Others fall because their motor responses are too slow. And still others fall because their cognitive attention is divided. They cannot balance and think at the same time. This last category is the one that interests me most. The dual task cost of balance is a well-documented phenomenon. When you ask someone to stand on one foot and simultaneously perform a cognitive task counting backward by sevens, for example, their balance deteriorates. The deterioration is greater in older adults and greater still in those at risk of falls. The reason is that balance is not fully automatic. It requires attentional resources. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, is actively involved in maintaining upright posture, particularly under challenging conditions. If you occupy the prefrontal cortex with a demanding cognitive task, there are fewer resources available for balance. The system becomes overloaded. You wobble. You fall. But here's the twist. The reverse is also true. Balance training improves cognitive performance, as the meta-analysis I mentioned earlier showed. And the improvement is not limited to older adults. A 2017 study led by Thomas Muehlbauer at the University of Basel in Switzerland, published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, found that a single session of balance training, 20 minutes of standing on one foot, standing on a wobble board, And walking on a narrow beam improved subsequent performance on a working memory task in healthy young adults aged 20 to 30. The effect lasted for at least 30 minutes after the training ended. The mechanism they proposed was cerebellar cortical activation. The balance exercises activated the cerebellum, which in turn activated the prefrontal cortex through the cerebello-thalamocortical pathway. The cognitive task benefited from the residual activation. This is not a trivial finding. It suggests that the relationship between balance and cognition is bidirectional. A degraded balance system impairs cognition, and a trained balance system enhances cognition. The one-legged standing test captures the state of that bidirectional relationship in a single number. And that number, averaged across populations, declines at a rate of roughly 0.5 to 1 second per year after age 60. The decline is not inevitable. It is modifiable, and it may be one of the most accessible, low-cost, and information-rich metrics of biological aging that exists. You do not need a lab. You do not need a blood draw. You need a floor and a willingness to look foolish for 10 seconds. Let me leave you with one final piece of the puzzle. The one-legged standing test has a strange relationship with time. The 10-second threshold used in the Brazilian studies was not arbitrary. It was chosen because it was the point at which the mortality risk curve steepened sharply. People who could hold the pose for less than 10 seconds had an 84% higher risk of death. People who could hold it for exactly 10 seconds or more had no statistically significant increase in risk. The curve did not continue to drop as the time increased beyond 10 seconds. Someone who could hold it for 30 seconds had the same mortality risk as someone who could hold it for 12 seconds. The protective effect plateaued. 10 seconds was enough. This suggests something important about the nature of the systems being measured. The test is not a measure of athletic ability or physical fitness. It is a threshold test. It asks a binary question. Can your vestibular, proprioceptive, motor, and cognitive systems integrate fast enough to keep you upright for a short period under a moderate challenge? If the answer is yes, you pass. If the answer is no, you fail. And the failure is not a matter of degree, it is a signal that at least one of those systems has degraded below a critical threshold. The exact nature of the degradation does not matter for the prediction. The failure itself carries the information. I want to be precise about what this does and does not mean. A single failed attempt on the one-legged standing test is not a death sentence. It is not even a diagnosis. It is a screening signal, a reason to investigate further. The test has a sensitivity of roughly 70% and a specificity of roughly 65% for predicting mortality over the next 7 years, which means it will miss some people who are at risk and flag some people who are not. It is not a replacement for a medical evaluation, but it is a remarkably inexpensive and accessible way to ask a question that no other routine test asks. How well are your multiple physiological systems integrating right now? Your blood pressure is a static number. Your cholesterol is a static number. Your one-legged standing time is a dynamic measurement, a snapshot of your nervous system in action, integrating information from your inner ear, your muscles, your eyes, and your brain, all in real time, under the simple constraint of gravity. There is a quiet beauty in this. The same force that holds the planets in orbit, that pulls the tides, that shaped the evolution of every multicellular organism on this planet, gravity, is also the force that reveals, in 10 seconds, the state of your nervous system. You do not need an MRI. You do not need a blood panel. You need 1 foot, a flat surface, and the willingness to pay attention to what your body tells you when you ask it to do something simple. The test does not require expertise. It requires honesty. And the result, whether you pass or fail, is information that belongs to you. So here is what I would suggest. Try it. Right now, stand up. Find a flat spot on the floor. Take off your shoes. Place your hands on your hips. Lift 1 foot off the ground so it hovers just above the floor. Start the timer in your head. And hold. Do not count. Do not think. Just balance. When you put your foot down, check how long you held. If it was less than 10 seconds, do not panic. But pay attention. Start practicing. 30 seconds a day. It is one of the simplest investments you can make in the integrity of the systems that keep you alive. And the return, measured in years, may be larger than any drug or diet you will ever try. The body is still a balancing machine. It is still waiting to be used.